because if it's torture, you're conscious by definition. And then what some people will say is, well, look, what I believe is that it's self-inflicted rather than externally inflicted by God. But if it's still punishment, if God's purposing the self-inflicted torture of a person as punishment, then it's still eternal torture. And this leads me to consider the malformative effects of a theology on a person's formation in Christ. So, for example, I regularly turn to 2 Timothy 3, where Paul says, all scripture is God-breathed, useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and training in righteousness, so that we are equipped for every good work, to make us like Jesus. So that if a theology has a malformative impact on you, that's all things equal, a good reason to reject or reconsider that theology. Do you think that in terms of trying to acclimate people to ideas like the eternal torture of others, that eternal conscious torment has a negative malformative impact on the sanctification or formation of people into images of Christ?
Yes, good question. I think it can. I don't think it always does. I'm trying to remember now. I think I wrote an appendix about this in the second edition of the Evangelical Universalist, when I spoke about the power of spiritual deformation rather than formation. Because, and this is my worry, anyone who thinks about it even briefly, and no matter how committed you are to it, it must trouble you. If it doesn't trouble you, you're probably a psychopath or something like that. So it must trouble you, and you have to find a way to rationalize it to yourself. And so to be able to live with yourself, you either ignore the issue, or if you're going to deal with it, you have to rationalize it to yourself. And so you end up having to tell yourself it's a good thing that this is that God would do this. It is a right thing that God would do. It's a just thing that God would do this. It's better that God would do this than not do this. I'm glad I live in a universe where this kind of thing happens. And we see this in the tradition, of course. I mean, in Aquinas, again, who I love Aquinas, but I mean, he thinks that the saints, he envisaged the part of the joy of the saints in heaven is looking at the sufferings of the eternal sufferings of the damned and rejoicing in the justice of God, the perfect justice of God, which is you would find in the Reformed tradition too, Jonathan Edwards and people like this. Again, Jonathan Edwards is a very interesting thinker, and in many ways inspirational, but in other ways, particularly here, you think when you're telling yourself this and having to persuade yourself to rejoice, and I had this conversation with a guy, he was boasting in how happy he was that his grandmother was being tortured forever in hell, and this was a sign of how godly he was. And I thought, well, that doesn't make it sound to me like you're like Jesus, or even like God who doesn't delight in the death of the wicked, like in Ezekiel. This guy delights in the suffering of people. It sounds more like the devil. So you've got a kind of process of spiritual formation that's making you more like the devil, and something's got to be wrong with that. I remember having a debate at an Anglican college with some students, mature students, and one of them was furious with me. He was a priest. Because he wanted I think it was his grandmother as well. He wanted her to be in hell, and he was really cross at the idea that God might not. And I suppose there might be all sorts of reasons why he'd feel like that, and I can understand that. However, part of his spiritual formation is not finding theological ways to